Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hey everyone, this is Britt Lightning from Vixen.
Hey everybody, this is Prescott Niles.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
You're listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
This is not a test. This is Play That Rock and Roll. I'm your host, Joe K, and today we have a very special episode. In the years I've been doing this show, I have interviewed a lot of authors, all of whom have been from the world of nonfiction writing. Biographers, memoirists, historians, that kind of thing. And I've also interviewed a number of recording artists, people who create music and tell stories with their songs. Well, today we're going to be speaking with someone who has ties to both worlds. He's a writer, but he's primarily a fiction writer. In fact, he's a very famous fiction writer. His name is David Morrell, and he is most well known for writing First Blood, which was adapted into the film starring Sylvester Stallone in 1982. That film launched the Rambo franchise, which went on to become one of Hollywood's most successful properties. David has also written The Brotherhood of the Rose, Creepers, Last Reveille, and many others. He's published over 30 books, in addition to several essays, comic books, and nonfiction works as well. In short, he's an incredibly prolific and successful author, so it is a huge honor to have him on the podcast today. The reason I wanted to have him on the show is because I've read several of David's books over the last couple of years, including First Blood, Last Reveille, The Covenant of the Flame, and the novelizations for Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Rambo 3, which he also wrote. In this interview, we discuss David's earliest inspirations, his background in music arrangement, how he developed the First Blood story, his intensive research process for his stories in historical settings, like Last Reveille, and how he approached writing the novelizations for the Rambo film sequels. We also discuss an upcoming book from author Nat Segaloff called The Rambo Report, which David wrote the foreword for. That's a very exciting project that will be released next year. If you want to learn more about David, you can find him on Facebook and Twitter, and you can also check out his website, davidmorrell.net. And without further ado, here's my conversation with legendary author David Morrell. Last podcast I did was with a fellow content creator, and we had a conversation based around the film franchise Beverly Hills Cop. And I know you noticed this because I saw it on Twitter, but the most recent installment in that film series includes the Rambo knife.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
You know,
Although I gather they misidentified it. I have not had the chance to see it. I respect the talent and all that, but
yeah.
it's being short. But I gather it's the Rambo 2 knife. It's the black one with the light, the glinting edge.
Yep.
Which is not exactly your combat knife. You want it all black. But nonetheless, and that was identified as, I gather, the First Blood knife, when in fact that's a different knife entirely. Not to complain, Jimmy Lau did, they're brilliant knives.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of those. I think I have the one from the second movie, and I think I have the one from the first movie. I use them when I do like vinyl reviews. I use the Rambo knife to open the sleeve.
Slice the cellophane.
Yeah.
Well, I guess they're good ones are hard to come by. I knew Jimmy Lyle, not Will, and he provided knives for me that were replicas. And but I'm very good friends with Gil Hibben, who made the knives for the third and the fourth film, and he also provided knives. And I bought some other knives from him. I'm particularly interested in a movie knives. Is an Alan Ladd movie from 1952 called The Iron Mistress, and that's about, it's a terribly fictionalized. It's a romance really, but the Bowie knife is in it.
Okay.
And no one knows what the Bowie knife looked like. So the Warner Brothers people did as much research as they could and then designed this absolutely wonderful knife. In fact, I'm just going to step away and I'll show you Gil's version
Okay.
of it in just a minute. So this is the Iron Mistress.
Oh my. I can tell that's heavy.
Yeah, it's heavy, but it's got a brass knives that were used for fighting had a brass top, so the blade that you might encounter would cut in and not slide down.
Oh,
And then it has this hilt here and here. I should pull it back so everybody can see. It's a little glinty if I move it around a little bit, and if I can safely do this to show the handle. And the knife, the Iron Mistress, in that movie inspired Jimmy Lyle and Gil Hibben to become knife makers. So here we have an irony that one generation's classic knife became the model for the Rambo knives. Wouldn't exist without the Iron Mistress. So
yeah.
I love that kind of thing. And so Gil made a version of, because he understood the continuity, he made a version of that.
Well, that's cool, and I like it because it's like you can get them now and it's not your typical movie memorabilia. It's a little different. It's a little out of
Yeah.
left field for some people. But so yeah, well maybe we'll talk about the movies in a bit, but let's go back in time. What I wanted to start with is I've talked to a lot of authors on this show, and I love talking to them about their influences, and what books and works inspired them and guided them on how they wanted to tell their first stories. You published First Blood in 1972. I know it was a multi-year writing process, and you were a young man when you were putting that
I
story
was very
together.
young.
Yes. My question is, what were some of the books and works that inspired you, not just in that story, but because it was your first book, to become an author as a career path?
Well, Graham Greene is alleged to have said, an unhappy childhood is a gold mine for a writer.
Oh,
And my father died in combat, and my mother was not able to hold a job and raise me at the same time. At a time, I mean, if social welfare programs for single mothers, et cetera, are not available as much as I would like today, it was almost non-existent back there. So she was, I believe, compelled. I never felt bitter about this, to put me in an orphanage. And so I lived in the orphanage for a while, and subsequently she boarded me, I don't know where she got the money, on a Mennonite farm. And you want to talk about influences. The man who ran the Mennonite farm was Wilfred Shantz, was his name. And he's just really in my memory. And if you think about First Blood, Teasel's first name is Wilfred.
right.
And if you think about it, in the movie, it's about, as it were, two brothers who are disagreeing. They're the same age. But the novel is a father-son story. It's
Right.
about a man old enough to be Rambo's father, different generation, different political views. And for a long time, my novels were about failed father figures. And I grew up lacking a father figure. And my mother remarried, and the stepfather he was not, they argued, and I slept under the bed. And I told stories to myself in the dark in which I was the hero saving someone. So in a sense, it was baked into me to be a storyteller. And that father-son, if somebody knows my novel, Brotherhood of the Rose, which I love to be able to say was the only miniseries. The adaptation was the only miniseries to be broadcast after the Super Bowl. I just love to be able to say that.
Yeah.
But that's about a CIA operative who goes to an orphanage to make two kids think they know he's not his father, but he's their father figure. And he uses them, and the whole part of the story is eventually they realize how much he has used them. And they, instead of loving him, turn into bitter hatred. And a lot of those early novels were about that. So those are pretty strong influences. In a way, I was programmed by my life to want to investigate those themes. As to what made me want to be a writer, and you've done some research. You're probably waiting for me to raise the TV show Route 66.
Great show.
For those who are unfamiliar, two guys in a Corvette convertible driving across the U.S. in search of America, in search of themselves, and it was filmed entirely on location. And I was 17 when that show premiered, and it talked to me in ways that no story had ever talked to me. And I decided that I realized that most of the episodes were written by one man whose his distinctive name was Sterling Silliphant. And I wrote to him. A librarian, I'm indebted to librarians, gave me the address for Screen Gems, which was the name at the end of every episode. And by God, he wrote back. And he became, my whole career is based upon people I chose as my father figure. And Sterling was one of them, and I had others. And so what I decided was how wonderful it would be if I could influence people the way Sterling influenced me. And so those are the two big things.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm going to have to pass that along to my girlfriend. My girlfriend's a librarian, so I think she'll be very happy to.
This is whenever I give a talk in the audience, I seldom miss this. Occasionally, somebody might go and say, "Oh, you didn't do it that time."
Sure.
But I always say, "Are there librarians in the audience?" And the hands come up, and I say, "You changed my life." Because if that person hadn't, I remember going in and saying, you know how you shake your head, I don't suppose.
Yeah.
I don't suppose you have the address for Screen Gems, a division of Columbia Pictures.
Yeah.
And she smiled at me and said, came back a minute later and gave me the address. And he answered me. I was 17. Sterling sent me a 2-page letter.
Wow.
He and I became very close later in my life. But so
yeah, so you were able to be in touch with your influences already at a young age. Some people have to wait a long time before they get that opportunity, if it comes at all. It's my understanding that, kind of around this time when you were still very young, that you were contemplating also perhaps a career in music.
That is correct.
A little bit about your music background?
Well, it's natural. I grew up, I was a teenager in the 1950s. And at that time, rock and roll, it was a big deal. And people my age tended to fixate on various icons. And I was raised in Southern Ontario in Canada. And at that time, Canada had one important singer-songwriter, Paul Anka, who came from Ottawa. And my mother said to me, why can't you be like him? Well, that's not a very nice thing to say. And then, of course, my response is, well, by God, I will be. But the more I learned, I realized that often the brains behind the performers were, it's not so much today, but in those days, the arranger. Yeah. And so I sought out, I was 16, and I sought out a music instructor. He was classical composer. He was a conductor of classical music. You want to go sophisticated.
Right.
If you don't want to aim low, you want to get the best brain you can. And so he taught me the harmony, counterpoint, orchestration. I did a little conducting. And I know music. I know at a time I had an idiot savant ability with a piano. I don't have hands that are wide enough to do. I can barely stretch an octave, so that's not a piano player's skill. But I have one thing music teaches you if you want to be an arranger is structure. And so what I would do, I knew chords. And I knew the symbols for chords, and I know what a B minor seventh is, and I know what an E flat diminished is, et cetera, et cetera. And I could do, if you gave me a chart, and piano scores usually have the name of the chord above the melody line, and I can do those chords. I could, not so much anymore. I could in four sharps and four flats. And in those keys, four keys, up to four sharps and four flat, so that at the time, later rock and roll bands were a big deal, but this was changing over from country club music, dance band music. And so they would have, in my generation, a conductor, and there'd be like 20 musicians, and people would dance to the music.
Yeah.
It's just like an old Fred Astaire movie. And the word got around that I had this idiot ability. I wouldn't do solos, but if they wanted fill chords, I could read any damn chart they had. And so they would call me sometimes at 4 o'clock on a PM on a Saturday afternoon and say, "Are you okay? Our piano player got sick. Can you come over?" And I didn't need rehearsal.
Oh, wow.
Because I was just doing the basic rhythm and fill, and it was a lot of fun. It teaches you structure.
Well, on the note about structure, this is something I've always kind of wanted to ask, but you're the first person really I can ask this because you have some background in music and also, of course, storytelling. Are there any parallels or echoes or any similarities between the structure of like music arrangement and the art of creative storytelling? Did you notice anything, or am I getting too heady with it?
No, not at all. And again, Nelson Riddle. We go back to the arrangers. Nelson, the arranger of his day was Nelson Riddle.
Okay.
Frank Sinatra would not have been Frank Sinatra without Nelson. And Frank admitted it. He'd go out and say, "And here's another great arrangement by Nelson Riddle." And he'd go into "I've Got You Under My Skin," which is, I think, the greatest arranged song in American music history that we have available to us. And what Frank and he believed was that a song was like making love, and that you start slow and then you build and then you fall away. And so that the best of the Sinatra Riddle creations had a structure to them and pacing and a very satisfying modulation that you don't get today. I'll refrain from mentioning musicians, but I see, say on Saturday Night Live, they'll have a guest musician, and the damn song sounds the same from the first bar to the last.
Right.
You could fall asleep on how constant the rhythm is and how unmodulated the thing is. It's just da, and not only that, they can't breathe. But that's a whole other thing. Frank Sinatra, you cannot hear him breathe. Partly because Frank knew that the microphone was his instrument, just like a saxophone is. And so if Frank needed to breathe, he put the microphone over here. And then then he came back. So, he used the mic or the non-mic to hide his if he did need to breathe. But so I think that in that generation, it taught you the rhythms of storytelling, and that songs have an act, stories have an act, and that's not the case now. Similarly, modern storytelling in the form of limited series, you cannot learn structure from as a writer from a limited series, except to know there's always in the third and fourth episodes, if it's a 6-episode series, they're padded, except they're going to be soft. The biggest problem of any story is the second act. And modern it just, they don't pay attention to that. There are a lot of lessons from there.
Oh, absolutely. That's fascinating to hear about. I've always been curious about what an author's perspective on that would be. So, let's talk about some of your work. First I have a couple of questions about that first book, First Blood. Again, published in 1972, like you said, very much about the generational divide. And there's a lot of stuff in the book that doesn't show up in the film that I think makes the book, for me at least, a more robust experience. One of the big differences of the book and the film is that Rambo and Teasel are like equal main characters in the
Yes.
book, where that's not the case in the film. So can you tell me a little bit about who were some of the people or some of the trends in society or whatever it was that inspired the characters of both of those guys?
Yeah, there were a couple of things. And again, we're now talking about the 60s generation, not the 50s. I was at Penn State getting a master's and a doctorate in American literature. I was a professor for my other life. And I had come from Canada. So in Penn State, as I think they welcomed me as a foreign student to fill a roster. I just don't know. But I was very grateful and maybe lucky to be accepted by Penn State. And that was in 1966. No one that I knew of in Canada, certainly not me, knew anything about Vietnam. So I'm in the United States and all I hear is Vietnam. Well, what's going on here? And I had been told by the immigration officer who admitted me and my wife and our baby, our infant daughter, that as guests of the United States, and I don't have a problem with this, that as guests of the United States, we should keep our political opinions to ourselves, that we don't have a right, we're not invested. And now I can see that troubles you a little, but I get
Well, it's
it.
different. You wouldn't hear that today.
No, you would not. I get it. So I respected that and I did not. I watched. And I won this is in 1968 and I'm trying to write, I want to write, I don't know what I want to write about. And you were talking about books. There was a great teacher whose name was Philip Klass with a K, Klass. And he had been a professional writer. Penn State had done this weird thing. They'd hired a professional writer who who wrote commercial fiction to teach fiction writing. How weird is that, right? And oh, I love that man. And he was so gracious to me. Under another name, William Tenn, he wrote science fiction. And I've done a little science fiction, but it's really not my field. Plus, you have to be an expert in the genre you're writing about. And I'm not an expert in science fiction. But he was very, very helpful to me. And he agreed reluctantly, because this is always a big leap of faith, to read some of my stuff, which was bad William Faulkner, bad James Joyce, because I was trapped in the academic environment. And he told me that everybody has a dominant emotion, and that for me, he felt it was fear, which was not. I had an anxious upbringing.
Sure.
And he said that he thought maybe I could break out of that trap of academia, of academic writing, if I wrote stories about fear. But not fear about drowning, not fear about heights, not fear of fire, but fear. And I wrote a story which would have been maybe the first of its kind, about a man in a game, in an area where you're allowed to target shoot, and somebody's out there target shooting people.
Oh, Jeez.
Now, this was 68, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a tired idea now. It
Right.
was not tired in 1968.
Yeah.
And I wrote this story about this idea. It wasn't Philip Klass's idea, that particular situation, but it came to me. And I thought, well, maybe this will work. And I gave it to him, and he said, "You've been reading Geoffrey Household." That's with a G, Geoffrey. And who the hell was Geoffrey Household? And he said, ah. So he pulled two books off the shelf. One was it's one of the most famous thrillers of all time called Rogue Male, Roguemale. It's been adapted into a movie several times. It's about a British big game hunter that hunts Hitler on the eve of the Second World War. And the book was written in 39. And when
So
the
very
story takes place,
contemporary.
yeah, oh, yeah, for the time it was.
Right.
And he gets caught on the first page.
Oh, gee, okay.
And it's really about his escape. And then he gave me another one about Watcher in the Shadows, about a man who'd been in a concentration camp as a prisoner, and now he survived, but he's just filled with hate, and he's going after all the guards, and he's killing one after another at that camp. The one he's going after was a double agent and was actually helping prisoners escape. And the guy won't listen to reason.
Right.
So these two people with, one able to understand the other, and they're in a deadly duel in the forest, just as Rogue Male is in the forest. And I read these and I said to Philip Klass, "You mean you're allowed to write this way?" And so that's how that happened.
And that's fascinating because your story, like that, what you just mentioned, is very contemporary. Because, I mean, it always blows my mind that First Blood came out while the Vietnam War was still going on. Because I'm, my age, I saw the film first, and for my generation, it felt like a post-Vietnam story. But reading the book, again, it's a difference that it's very much of that time. When you brought this story to publishers, and I just wonder, based on what you told me about, the immigration thing, what was anyone apprehensive? I mean, what was the reaction to the pitch of this story, given how contemporary it was?
Well, I wrote the novel rather than pitched it, and Philip Klass was an immense help. And anybody who knows crime fiction, if the name Donald E. Westlake is useful to them, or the name Richard Stark, Don is Richard Stark in the Parker novels. Philip Klass and Donald E. Westlake were close friends, and Don read First Blood in drafts too. So they were both, Don was very helpful too. I should have added earlier that while part of the deal for me to be at Penn State was I would teach writing. So I was teaching first-year students how to write essays. And God knows why they chose me, because I had no credentials. There must have been some intuition. And students in my class for the freshman year were students back from Vietnam. So and they were very puzzled why their age, wasn't in the war.
Right.
So we had conversations, and I learned an awful lot from them. So there were contemporary things that were happening. And anyhow, one of the things, my master's thesis is on Hemingway's style. I do not write like Hemingway. I would not dare to write like Hemingway. But Hemingway had a purity to him. He said, if you're going to write something, write like it hasn't been written before. And one of my favorite peeves with action stories is people who have a shot rang out.
Oh.
That drives me crazy. And it shows the laziness of the mentality that's writing that, and it's all guff, it's all cliche.
Cliche, yeah.
And I was working on the book for a while, and in 1969, Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch came out. Do you know the movie?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah.
And that revolutionized Westerns
Right.
because of its approach to violence and the demythologizing. And I said, maybe this is the approach I can use in First Blood. It's as if I'm Sam Peckinpah and I'm going to try to write an action book of the sort that's never been written before. And when I finished it in 3 years, lots of rewriting. And I showed it. Philip Klass's agent was a man named Henry Morrison. And Henry Morrison represented Donald E. Westlake and eventually Robert Ludlum. And because of Phil, Henry Morrison agreed to look at it. So now I had an agent. And then he read it and he said, yeah, there's something here. But he said, it's so violent that I don't think we can get a big publisher to do it. He said, I think I can get you a paperback deal. Well, 6 weeks later, we had a hardback deal.
Okay.
And it was a reputable publisher that actually was known for its nonfiction. The New Aerobics, which started the whole thing about jogging, body language, open marriage. They published all of those, but they wanted to do some fiction.
So the culture was changing. You're saying
The
times
culture was
They,
changing.
they were
Yeah.
more open to an edgier story.
Yeah, I mean, a year earlier, a year later, no.
Oh,
I mean, there's some times, and that's why Hemingway talked about talent, discipline, and luck.
oh yeah.
And luck, you cannot discount luck. And I certainly have the discipline. It might be a debate with some people whether I have the talent, but I have the discipline and I certainly had the luck. And every major newspaper and magazine reviewed that book. I mean, a first novel, unheard of. I mean, because the time was right, 1972.
Yeah.
People were sick of Vietnam. And I don't want to minimize the work I put in, but you have to realize sometimes there's a slot that's meant to be.
Well, yeah, and I know it registered with people in a big way because it got, of course, got optioned later into a film, and like you said, it was reviewed by all these newspapers. So that makes me very curious about that decade between the book being published and the film specifically.
Mhm.
Because I think, for me reading the book, when I did, it was very difficult for me to not picture Stallone as Rambo in the book in my mind.
Mhm.
But what did you hear from people before the movie came out that might impact how they felt about the book? What was the initial reaction in those first couple of years? What did you hear from?
Well, the book was optioned for movies almost immediately.
Oh wow, yeah. That's
First, Stanley Kramer said he wanted to option it, and that's not a name we talk about much, but Stanley Kramer in his day, major producer. And but the contract never came, and in the end he reneged. And then a producer named Lawrence Terman, who had co-produced The Graduate, found the book. It wasn't that my agent sent it; he sent it to people, but Larry just found the book, and he said, "This is a book that Richard Brooks could write and direct." So he went to Columbia, and Columbia made a deal to buy the book outright for Richard Brooks to write and direct. But whatever went wrong, a year later, Columbia sold it to Warner Brothers, where Martin Ritt was. There's some debate about this, but what I heard was it was very close to a deal that Martin Ritt of HUD and Sounder would direct, maybe with Newman. But again, but what is certain is when that didn't appear, for certain, Sidney Pollack was going to direct Steve McQueen.
oh wow.
That was a go-ahead until better minds prevailed, and Newman would have been wrong too,
Yeah.
because in 1975 there were no 40-ish Vietnam veterans.
Right.
So they realized the mistake, and then it drifted and went through various people, and then eventually in '81, a company called Carolco acquired the property, and they had the idea of using Sly, who's a brilliant choice.
Yeah.
Is Richard Crenna, whom I've talked to both. I've talked to Sly often, and I had the opportunity to talk to Richard as well, not as often. But Richard said that in his opinion, in all the movies he'd been in, and he was in a lot,
Yeah.
the two actors who were best in front of the camera, not necessarily Shakespearean emotive actors, not Richard Burton,
Right.
but they knew what to do in front of a camera,
Yeah.
which a lot of actors did not know how to do. And they were Steve McQueen and Sylvester Stallone.
Oh, yeah.
And when you see Sylvester's movie acting is eyes. And both of those guys, I've written about McQueen.
Yeah.
But so, it was a long, long voyage. It was a 10-year experience of development. And again, would the picture have been as successful in 75 or 80? It's very hard to tell because
Yeah.
Rambo became a Ronald Reagan character.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's got that quote, right? Rambo
Yeah.
is Republican or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of a recent very popular movie. And in the spirit of Rambo, let me tell you, we're gonna win this time.
Did you hear from guys who came back from the war, guys who were in the service, who like related to the story? Did you have positive feedback from veterans?
I did. One of my most memorable signings. Now, this was after the movie came out, but it relates. I was doing a signing for First Blood, one of the reissues at the time the movie was released. And a man came up and said that he'd been in Vietnam and he wanted to read the book and all. And we had a conversation and he went away. And then his wife was behind him and she came in and she said, this all saved my marriage. She said that my husband, from whatever happened in Vietnam, and the people don't generally talk about their war experiences. So whatever happened, I mean, if you were a clerk, I don't mean to minimize that, but if you did not see action, that's a different matter. But if, bad stuff was happening, that's another matter. And she said that after he saw the movie, he went home and he wept. And then he started to talk. And then, she understood him better. And I have no idea how that story evolved, but I've heard that story a lot.
Yeah.
The movie changed the culture.
Yeah.
It changed attitudes toward veterans of unpopular wars.
Yeah.
And arguably made post-traumatic stress disorder an understandable phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's very rare. I admire the movie a lot. It's a different train track, same plot, but different train track is my novel. And I was flattered. I was asked to do an audio commentary for the movie. So on home video discs, I have an audio track comparing the novel and the film, and lots of backstories. But it's rare for an author to be involved. Books don't generally have the influence that a movie does, and to be involved with a phenomenon in which actually a difference was made, and I think it was a positive difference.
Yeah.
To acknowledge the pain and the consequence of someone having been in combat.
Absolutely. Have you ever read Born in the U.S., Born on the 4th of July by Ron Kovic?
Yeah.
I read that earlier this year as well. And, that's another one where I saw some parallels in your story and his, particularly about the tension between veterans coming home and the police, law enforcement.
Well, yes. And it wasn't just, and again, I want to make clear, I'm not disrespecting police
Of
officers.
course, yeah.
But at the time,
Yeah.
the tension in the culture between youngsters, people in the late teens, early 20s, up to 25, the old gag was if you're over 30, you can't be trusted.
Yeah.
But that as my research, I grew this mustache. The reason I still have it is my wife knows me only for the mustache,
Oh.
and she threatens to move out if I shave it off because she'll be living with a stranger. So, but I grew as research, and people know a little bit about my work, know how committed I am to the research.
Yeah.
And I just thought, what would happen? Well, what happened was pretty extreme. I couldn't go off campus, to places where civilians, let us say, non-academics were, without having policemen insult me as I walked past them, without having, people, clerks in stores insult me, there's a worm on, there's a hairy thing on, there's a caterpillar on your, or, clean yourself up. And my hair was not long. And what some people don't know if they haven't read the book is Rambo is very much of his time, and he has very long hair and he has a beard, and you could think of him as a hippie
Sure.
in that culture. And that's police bait in 1968, 69, 70, 71, 72, leading up to the Kent State in 1970, the National Guardsmen shooting American students to death.
Yeah.
And it was a very contentious time. And so when the movie came out, now Sly had the long hair, but he didn't have facial hair, right?
Yeah.
And the policeman, Brian Dennehy, who fine actor, right?
Yeah.
And always interesting to watch. And Brian says to Sly, "We don't look like guys who look like you coming to our town." Well, by then, 1982, and I was in the back of the theater for where I was teaching. I snuck in through the back to watch. And people were leaning over saying, "Well, what's wrong with the way he looks?" Because he looked like every male in the audience with the hair down to here. And I thought the picture's going to tank. But then the fight in the jail happened.
Right.
And then it all tilted. But there's that moment early in the film where it could go other ways because he doesn't look like anybody, like different from anybody else. But whereas in 1972, oh boy, he would have been an automatic target for police officers. So, different culture.
Well, yeah, and right on that cultural difference note is that what Teasel also says, something about Rambo having that flag on his patch, and he's or on his jacket, and he says it in like a negative way. And now, we're so far removed from that, like. A flag is a signifier of, I mean, if anything, a more conservative, pro-American stance. And it's just, that's such a weird thing for someone my generation to encounter,
And you can see why the book and the movie have been taught in colleges, because in terms of my specialty at Penn State, my degree is in American literature, but Penn State was the founder of a study called of a discipline called American Studies, in which you use music and movies and books and everything else to try to get a grasp of American society at different times. And so the movie and the book are really useful in American Studies classes to talk about that moment from 1968, when I started writing the book, up to 1982, when the film comes out. And I guess you could go to 1985 with the second film, which was an unbelievable hit. Yeah. It had the biggest opening of any movie in history in 1985, but it was a different character.
Right.
The character in the second movie is not the character in the first. It had morphed as the producers gauged what was happening in the culture. And I mean, it's a clever, modulation, but again, you can have a lot of fun in a college course. Yeah. And even in the right high school, although you can hear the parents objecting right away.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But there's a lot to be discussed there about what America was and how it changed and where it's gone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, how the culture reflects on the characters through the whole film series is very interesting. Let's pivot from First Blood for a second. So I wanted to ask you about another book of yours that I read,
Yes,
Last Reveille.
heavily.
I really enjoyed that one, and I know that that book was, inspired by your love of westerns. But what I want to talk about with this book is something you mentioned just a few moments ago: is your research process.
Yeah.
I find the research process for nonfictions interesting. So, like, tell me a little bit more about the lengths that you went to achieve the historical accuracy
Well,
that you presented in the book.
for people who don't know, it's in 1916, a Mexican bandit named Pancho Villa crossed the American line with his band of whatever and raided a New Mexican border town called Columbus. And as it happened, Columbus had a military base there. It wasn't a big one, but it was essentially where this is the period when cavalry were transitioning to mechanized. And that really, and again, it's Peckinpah, right? It's that theme that he had. And what happened is fascinating. The military there mounted up, and there was a running gun battle, and they went. Villa's people left the country, and we went after them to a degree, and then said, "Oh well, we're in Mexico. Maybe we ought to go back."
Right.
Well, the First World War was in progress. America had not yet entered. And it was known that the Germans were in Mexico trying to encourage Mexico to maybe open another front or at least make themselves a nuisance. And the government met and decided, the Senate and the House of Representatives decided that they were going to send an armed column into Mexico after Villa. And the guy running it was, it's a disparaging term now, but he's known by it as Black Jack Pershing.
Oh yeah, General Pershing. Yeah.
And Patton was there as well, not yet a general.
Mhm.
And there were two prongs. One went in from Columbus in New Mexico, and another prong went in from Arizona. And they were going to meet and then go on. And this was the first time the American military had used automobiles. This was the first time they had used aircraft. This was the first time they had used machine guns. And
That's because they
basically,
were like trying it out because they saw WW1 on
got
the
it.
horizon.
You got it. They were rehearsing for the First World War.
Right. Yeah.
And so the story is about that invasion. It's hard to imagine, but we invaded Mexico as seen through, and again, by now you can predict the characters. There's a young man who's who's in there, and suddenly here's the attack. He just shows up in Columbus, and that night there's the gun battle. And the other person is a scout whose name is Miles Callender. And I wouldn't do this these days, but Miles Callender, Space and Time, because he was old enough, he is old enough to have been in this as a child, as a youngster in the Civil War. He was in the Indian Wars as a scout. He was in Cuba. He was in the Philippines. And this is his last campaign. And he decides to teach this youngster what it's all about and how to survive. And in the process, the youngster begins to despise him.
Yeah.
And because of the necessity of the stark values that it takes to survive in combat. Anyhow, I just loved the idea, and I did go to Columbus. I went down there and looked, and amazingly, this would have been in '74. 75, somewhere in there. I went down with my family on a car trip, and it wasn't that different from photographs in 1916. And you could see there was a mound where I can't remember now if there was a flagpole where where the military flags as well as the flag for the United States. And you could see where the barracks had been. They're gone now, but you could see the layout. And there was like two streets. It was like an old Western town. And I thought, oh, this is just, it's like, a time warp.
Yeah.
And then I dove in, I read everything I could about that period.
And with that review of, I mean, are you talking about like military records? Are you talking about previous books, or what was the documents that you went through?
Well, I went through the New York Times and similar newspapers on microfilm to see what they were saying. And in fact, the book begins with portions of newspaper accounts.
Right. Yep.
And then I went through, history of Mexico, history of the cavalry in the United States, history of, what was going on the border at that time, and prelude to World War One. I mean, these things, it just keeps going. You've got to want to learn. And I loved it. And it's John Wayne is said, my agent told me that Wayne's representative said that he gave some thought to playing the character, but Wayne was very ill at the time.
Right. Yep.
And the other issue was that apparently John Wayne's son, one of them, said that he thought the parallel between the young and the older man would maybe be conceived as too close to the parallel in Red River.
Oh, okay.
And so nothing moved forward. But it was a disappointment because John Wayne is a fine movie actor.
Oh, absolutely.
And people get mixed up in the politics.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you look at, and we could debate all day about the Searchers and the problems with the Searchers. But if you look at Red River or The Shootist as, I mean, oh boy, I mean, and this man knew I think Richard Crenna would have added John Wayne to the Steve McQueen, Sylvester Stallone. So Stephen King once told me, Steve and I were close for many years. Not that we had a falling out, but friendships sometimes evaporate.
Yep.
Steve told me that he thought it was one of my best books.
Wow, that's quite a compliment. When it comes to, I was just going to ask you about this. So, that comes out in the late 70s. I guess there was some
77.
talk. Yeah, there was some talk about perhaps making a film out of it.
Not much.
Not much.
A little bit. We have to remember the 70s. There were a lot of really good Westerns made in the 70s. People say, in reaction to the Wild Bunch, in 69, the Wild Bunch, thereafter, films either deliberately followed the old traditions to say the Wild Bunch didn't matter, or else they used the Wild Bunch's revisionistic view to move forward. And you get wonderful movies like Lozana's Raid, which is a Burt Lancaster movie, which is a avowed parallel to the Vietnam War.
Oh, wow.
And so you get a lot of Vietnam War disguised Westerns, or else you get, like Little Big Man, socially conscious Westerns. And it was a great time, but in 81, when did Heaven's Gate come out?
Oh yeah, 80,
and that was the end, for a decade. Westerns were, because that movie was, and we can debate the merits of the movie,
right.
But there's no question that was a tremendous failure financially. And it wasn't until Dances with Wolves in the 90s, and then the Unforgiven, the Clint Eastwood movie, and let's give Kevin Costner mention his name with Dances with Wolves, that Westerns came back. So there was that period where yes, the Westerns were popular and then suddenly they weren't. And so, given how long it takes to develop a movie, I'm not surprised that there was a hesitancy to go after that as a film project.
Well, this is just a fun little thought experiment I had when I was reading the book because in my mind, when I was reading the book, I thought, what if this was made into a film shortly after First Blood, the movie, was released, and
Yes.
because that was a hit. And in my mind, I cast Nick Nolte as Miles Calendar and Emilio
Okay.
Estevez as Prentice. So I don't know what to do with that information, but I thought you might get a kick out of
Well,
it.
I think you need somebody who is believably who could have had all those years of military experience. George C. Scott was the name that was talked about. It has to be a much older, perhaps than you mentioned, and somebody who's much perhaps younger than you
Yeah.
mentioned for it to work. Yeah, almost all my novels have been optioned for movies. A few got made, but that's the way the movie business is. But Last Reveille was never optioned.
Oh, interesting.
That's one of the few that never ever happened. And whatever.
Well, hey, Kevin Costner is still out there right now making westerns. I say there's still time.
Well,
Let's
we
give him a
wish
call.
Kevin luck. I saw Horizon in the theater, and I'm not sure the movie coheres, but damn, it's good looking.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, yeah.
It's so good looking. And if Horizon 2 opened tomorrow in a theater, I'd go see that too. Even though it's really like a TV series with 1 hour episodes.
Right.
But I don't care. Anything that looks that good has to be seen on a big screen.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is off topic, but last year or year before, you were posting quite a bit about Oppenheimer and what a big deal it was to
Yes.
see on screen. On your recommendation, I went to see it in the theater, and you were absolutely correct.
It must be seen in a theater.
Absolutely.
I mean, not that you can. I mean, it's not diminished exactly on a small screen, but Donald Westlake had an expression, movie.
Oh,
He
yeah.
said some movies were movie and they had to be seen big. And Oppenheimer, it's a big movie.
Absolutely.
And it was filmed not far from here where I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I can see from where I am, I can see across the valley to where, Los Alamos is and where they developed the bomb. And a lot of Oppenheimer was filmed in areas that I'm familiar with, so that helped. But oh boy, it made New Mexico look great.
Oh, yeah, sure did. Well, okay, before we get out of here, I got two last questions for you, and one of them is something I don't normally do, but it's a question from the audience, actually, a friend of the show. A guy named Adam Kidd came up with this, and I thought it was a good thought experiment for you. He wanted to know that if you were to write First Blood today,
Mhm.
and have John Rambo as a veteran of a current 21st century war, say Afghanistan and Iraq, what are some of the things, given the culture conversation we've been having, that would
Mhm.
be different from when you first published it?
I can't, I understand the question,
Yeah,
and I can't answer it. I mean, I'm so rooted in, and it was a very specific time.
yeah,
We never had a war as unpopular as that. I mean, no one is
right,
destroying cities for a war. Nobody burned down whole neighborhoods because of Iraq.
right.
And so that it was a different, nobody these days is saying don't trust anybody over 30. It's more like don't trust anybody.
Right.
And, and so that there isn't any parallel to it. But what might be fun is have your friend and anybody listening, Quentin Tarantino knows the novel well and has wonderful things to say about it and has talked, he said, if he were ever to do a remake, it would be First Blood. And you can get his comments if you Google Quentin Tarantino and First Blood.
Oh,
I
interesting.
mean, it's out there.
Yeah,
2 years ago, he talked about it a lot. It's never going to happen.
yeah,
But it made me happy because he knew the novel so well.
Yeah.
I mean, he talks about the way I handle the material. Not that I don't know if he disapproves of the movie as it exists. It's just that he prefers my novel. And he had Kurt Russell as Teasel and Adam Driver as Rambo.
I like that.
Well, it's a
Especially Kurt
view,
Russell
but
as
he gets it, the old guy and the young guy,
Yeah.
the generation gap. And I didn't know if you'd think about it as a period piece, but talking about remakes, though, I mean, is Inglorious Bastards not a remake?
All right.
Is Jackie Brown,
Yeah.
well, I guess it's not a remake, that isn't, but he has dabbled in that, but I get it. It's so Inglorious Bastards, his version is so far from the European original. But anyhow, I'm a big fan of Quentin,
Oh,
and
yeah,
that's
I am
not
too.
because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, my last question for you is just kind of an oddball curiosity, and this just came up for me because I did a podcast earlier this year about Born in the USA, the Springsteen song, and how it relates to Vietnam and all that. And in that time when that movie came out, Springsteen kind of got that nickname, the Rambo of rock, for whatever reason, because they're both muscular and they both have this kind of a similar look. But the odd thing about, or the interesting thing about the film Rambo 2 is that the plot is that he's going back to Vietnam to rescue Vietnam POWs that had been held after the war, which I have come to learn was a fairly commonly held belief at the time that was actually going on. When you first heard that that was the plan for the script, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I thought it was pretty interesting, but and again, I mean, it's a fun movie. It's, I mean, my grandkids are 21 years old, and they're gradually getting used to me having been the creator of Rambo, because nothing ever happens in your own family.
Right.
So I showed them First Blood last year, and then I thought, well, I'll show them Rambo 2 this year, and they thought it was hilarious. I mean, it is. I mean, it's so over the top. I mean, it's just it's almost like a parody of an action movie.
Yeah.
Even though it's taking itself seriously. I mean, I have a great respect for it, and it certainly is behind you. We talked about this before we started. You have a vinyl collection of Jerry Goldsmith's music for the Rambo film, and Jerry is, one of my idols as a film composer, along with Korngold and Max Steiner from the other generation. And I mean, Jerry, if he wrote the score, it's a good movie.
Oh, absolutely.
And so in the bow and arrow, it's really a Tarzan movie in a way. And the fight in the helicopter is like the fight on the stagecoach. It's sort of out of control. It's like a Western. I mean, it's so many tropes. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I'm the only one who can write novels about Rambo by contract. It's in the movie contract.
Oh, okay.
So it's a funny story. They wanted me to write a novelization.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that's a pretty derivative, what? It's like photocopying the screenplay.
Yeah.
And so I said no. And then they phoned again and they phoned again. And I knew the producer, I knew the producers pretty well. Mario Casar, not as well as Andrew Vanya. Andy and I got along. He even took me to his home once. And believe me, producers do not take you to their home. So I was talking to Andy, and he said, "You really want to be a part of this?" He said, "Because this is going to be a big movie."
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, yeah. So the next morning, the doorbell rang at 8 o'clock. And like, who the hell rings the doorbell at 8 o'clock? Now, bear in mind, this is 1984.
The police.
It's the police. They've caught me. They found out. So I opened the door, and it's a Federal Express guy.
Oh, okay.
So now I didn't know about Federal Express. I mean, that was a very new
Yeah.
delivery system. Guy says here, sign for it. And I'm thinking, well. So I tear it open and it's a cassette. So I have time before I'm going to school. I've got a 9:30 class I have to teach. So I go to the TV and I put it in the VHS machine. Remember those?
Yeah, I still got
And
mine.
and here comes Sylvester in the helicopter with Jerry's music pounding away, attacking the village, the encampment, and landing and taking the mini M60 and go dun, 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 and then he's rescuing the hostages.
Yep.
And then it ended. That's what they'd cut together from that scene.
Okay.
It was only 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So I went to my wife who was making breakfast for our kids. I said, he's right. This is going to be a big movie. So we were able to make a deal whereby there wasn't enough in the shooting script. The shooting script literally had lines like Rambo jumps up and shoots this guy. Rambo jumps up and shoots that guy. It was 86 pages in the version I got, and I didn't. So I told Andy, all right, in principle, I get it. This is going to be a big movie. I need a little freedom here. And it's not here. I said, do you have anything else? Do you have any cut scenes and anything? And he said, well, we have the James Cameron script. Pause.
Yeah.
Now, James Cameron wasn't James Cameron then.
Right, at that point, right.
He'd worked for Roger Corman. He'd done Terminator.
Terminator, yes.
I knew who James Cameron was. I said, really? Can you send me, do you have control of it? They said, sure, we own it. I said, can you send me the script? Well, oh my God, what a script. But it was too dark. It starts with Rambo in an insane asylum in the basement behind bars.
Oh.
With an armed guard outside, and Troutman comes to visit him and the light is off. And the guard says to Troutman, he broke the light again. He thinks he's the fucking Prince of Darkness.
Wow.
I'm in heaven.
Yeah.
So I said to Andy, all right, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be 1/3 shooting script, 1/3 James Cameron, and 1/3 me. Because in all of these, don't you think that Rambo would have had a reaction to go back to the POW camp that he escaped from? I mean, it's not here.
Right.
So that's the stuff I want to put back in. So I had the liberty to do that because they needed me at a time when novelizations were important for merchandising, not now. So he said, fine. So it's this weird amalgam. There's never been a novelization like it. It broke all the rules. It was a New York Times bestseller. And there's a company called Vinegar Syndrome, which is a home video actual disc in your hand company that releases movies, and they're going into the movie tie-in business, and they're going to release next year both Rambo 2 and Rambo 3 in a mock paperback with introductions I've written about novelizations for their market in a limited edition. I think it'd be 7,000 copies or something.
Whoa.
So isn't that cool?
Great news.
Yeah, it's very cool. I feel really good about the novelization because I was able to do in the third one the same thing. There were, in this case, the best scripts were the early ones. And then for reasons of budget, they got simpler. And also, I have no idea what happened. I mean, they got really simple. And I'm not knocking the movie, but that first script was a gem. It was like Rambo of Arabia.
Yeah.
And so I said to Andy, look, you're changing the script every week. We need to agree on one script. And I said, the one I want is the first one. And again, because they needed it for marketing. So I chose that one. That was 1/3 unseen script with a whole lot of stuff that's not in the movie. Oh God, it's a good script. And then maybe half of it's me. And so it was, they were exciting experiments.
Well, they're fantastic. Because like when I read First Blood, I got a hold of the sequel novelizations because I found out that you wrote them, and especially with that third one, I was totally blown away by how much more
Yeah.
is in that story. I mean, there's so much in the story of your novelization for the third one that I do sort of wonder about what had happened with the film, because it's just like there's so much good stuff here. Why didn't more of that make the jump to
It
the
was
big screen?
it was budget, and this is this sort of thing we should talk. We said we would. My friend Nat Segaloff
Yes.
has a book coming out next year, the Rambo Report, on Father's Day. And Nat is a respected writer about films. He's got a book about William Friedkin, one about Arthur Penn. And it's the whole thing. The history of how a book happened, the 3 books, the movies, all the other stuff. And I read every draft so I can vouch for it. And I wrote a foreword to it. And this will, all things Rambo in this thing. It's really quite interesting. There's a lot of revelations, such as the Steve McQueen stuff that we talked about earlier. Anyway, I wanted to make sure we got that in, and the history of the novelizations is in it, and how these things happen and why they are the way they are. But I'm particularly fond of the third of the novelization for the third movie.
Well, that's just such great news to hear that project is on the horizon. David, this has been already just one of my favorite conversations I've had on this show.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate you coming by, and I appreciate so much the books that you've written, because I've since reading First Blood, I've got a whole stack of them. I've been reading The Last Covenant. I'm definitely going to be reading Blood Oath. I'm really, I've definitely become a big fan of your writing style. So talking to you today has been a real treat, man.
If I can, the books because people might be curious. I mean, we're here talking about First Blood, but the books that people say, well, what would you recommend? I mean, if they don't know my work, and so there are 4 books.
Okay, yeah.
That I recommend, and they all have action and suspense, but they show my interest in trying to go in different directions. And so there's First Blood, of course, which is basically outdoor action, somewhat military. Brotherhood of the Rose, which is a classic espionage novel.
Yep.
Creepers, which is non-supernatural horror and has been made into a movie. I don't know when it'll be released.
Oh yeah, I heard about that. Yeah.
And then Murder is a Fine Art, which is my interest in history, because Last Reveille is a Victorian mystery thriller set in 1854, which is absolutely historically authentic.
Oh,
And is about, in real life, the first publicized mass murder in English history, which is not Jack the Ripper. It was the 1811 Radcliffe Highway murders, which are replicated in the novel. And those 4, First Blood, Brotherhood of the Rose, Creepers, and Murder is a Fine Art, those are the books that I don't, I love Last Reveille, but if we're looking for, a sense of like hinge pins, and those are the 4 that I usually go for.
Well, I'm adding them all to my list for
Well,
the immediate future.
And you're really easy to talk to. It's been actually a pleasure chatting with you.
Well, thanks. That means a lot. I appreciate that. This has been my first foray into talking to someone who does creative writing. I want to do that more on this show because, I talk to a lot of artists, and the creative process is a fascinating thing to discuss. So thanks for opening, this part of the show with me. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening. There's no shortage of great content out there, so you choosing to spend some time listening to this show means quite a lot. If you're so inclined, please give this podcast a 5-star rating and a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. And share our links wherever you can, or mention this show to anyone you know looking for a podcast recommendation. All of this helps us out a great deal, and I appreciate it. You can connect with us on social media too. We are at Play That Podcast on Facebook, Threads, Blue Sky, and even TikTok. Or we are at Play That Rock and Roll on YouTube and Instagram. please post a comment and say hello. Finally, Play That Rock and Roll is a proud member of the Pantheon podcast community. So if you're looking for more music podcasts beyond this one, trust me, start with Pantheon. You won't be disappointed. Otherwise, I appreciate any and all efforts you take to support us here at Play That Rock and Roll. Be sure to join us next time for more great music and stories from the world of classic rock.